Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael the Man Skobac. Welcome back. How are you this beautiful day, Rabbi? Thank you for joining us again.
It is awesome to be here with you, William.
Thank you. The pleasure is certainly all mine, no doubt. Very good. So we got a peculiar diet going on today, I see.
Yeah.
So, Revelation chapter 10, the eating of the scrolls. Of course, that's the title was, what'd you call it? The scroll down diet.
Yeah, a lot of fiber.
A lot of fiber. There you go. Well, very good. Well, I will most certainly pass this on along to you and let you do your thing and teach us away.
So first of all, today is the new moon, Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the month of Shvat. And it's interesting that the letters in the name Shvat, Shin, Bet, Tet, stands for Shenishma Besorot Tovot, that we should hear good news. So that's the blessing for this month, the month of Shvat. Today is Rosh Chodesh, basically the new moon, beginning of the month. So before we get into some of the content of this pretty short chapter 10 in Revelation, it really bears repeating two observations that we've already made a number of times in the past about the Greek scriptures. And I think it's just a good time to review this because it just is important to remember this as we're going through a book like Revelation. So the two observations I wanted to share were, number one, that the Greek scriptures are written in Greek, sort of obvious. And because it's so obvious, people often don't think about it. They don't think about the significance of the fact that the Greek Testament is written in Greek. But Hebrew, we know, is called Lashon HaKodesh. Hebrew is called the Holy Tongue, Lashon HaKodesh, or the Holy Language. And the question is, why is Hebrew considered to be the holy or unique or special language? So first of all, Hebrew is the language with which the world was created. When God said, "Let there be light," he didn't say in English, "Let there be light." He didn't say it in Spanish or in German or any other language. God said, as the Torah tells us, Yehi or. In Hebrew, Yehi or, let there be light. And the creative process, the world is created basically with the expression of God's will through the Hebrew language. It's interesting that what's going on here is that creation is basically the projection of God's will. Right? God wants something to happen, it happens. And the way the scriptures explain or relate the projection of God's will is through the articulation of language. And when God utters these words in Hebrew, Yehi or, we're going to see in a few minutes that the Hebrew language is very, very special. It's unusual. And there is profound meaning in every single letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So when a person, or here, when God utters these holy letters and expresses his will through these letters, the letters themselves, in a sense, capture God's will, and they capture the creative forces that go into the creation of the world. So first thing to just remember is that God creates the world using the Hebrew language. It's interesting that the very first verse in the Torah is Bereshit bara, in the beginning, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, et hashamayim, the heavens, ve'et haaretz, and the earth. And the truth is that this verse did not need the word et and ve'et. The word et in Hebrew doesn't have a translation. It precedes the direct object of a sentence. So it really just could have said, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning, God created Hashemayim, the haaretz, the heavens and the earth. But it doesn't say that. It uses this unusual word, which comes up really, it's one of the most frequent words in the Bible, et. And again, et does not have a translation. It basically is sort of a flavor word that precedes the direct object of a sentence. But the mystics point out that et is the first and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph and Taf. So they explain, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created et, Aleph to Taf, meaning the Hebrew alphabet. The first thing that God created, in a sense, was the Hebrew alphabet, and with those letters, he created the world. So number one thing to remember is that the world is created with Hebrew. Secondly, to remember that Hebrew was the original language of mankind. If we go back to Genesis chapter 11, verse 1, this is preceding the whole story of the building of the Tower of Babel. So it says that the whole world was of safa achat, of one language. The whole world was of one language. What language was that? So in Rashi's commentary, Rashi is the great French-German commentary to the Torah written about 1,000 years ago. He says this was Lashon HaKodesh. Again, the holy tongue, the holy language, or Hebrew. And it's interesting for fans of gematria, of using the numerical value of letters to find significance. If you add up the numerical value of the letters in the phrase safa achat, again, safa, tongue or language, achat, one, and you add up the numerical value of the letters in the phrase that Rashi uses, Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, the holy language. So the numerical value is essentially the same. It's significant that when, again, the Torah says one language or one tongue, and Rashi tells us it happens to be Hebrew, I don't know why anyone would suspect it was another language like, Chinese or Swahili. The Hebrew is the only language we've had in the Bible because that's how God created the world. But just in case you're wondering, when Genesis 11 speaks about the whole world having one tongue or one language, so Rashi explicitly says it is Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, or what we call Hebrew. And again, the numerical value of what the Torah says, one language or one tongue, and what Rashi says is the same. It's very fascinating. So that's two reasons to bear in mind why Hebrew is special. Number one, Hebrew is a language with which God created the world. Number two, it's the original language of mankind. Number three, Hebrew is the language of Scripture. When God revealed the Torah, it was in Hebrew. And the writings and the prophets essentially are in Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh. How is Hebrew separate? How is the Hebrew holy? How is Hebrew different? How is Hebrew unique? So there are many reasons why Hebrew is unique. One of the reasons I mentioned earlier, I just want to expand on it a little bit, is that in every other language, the letters have no meaning. The letters are just there to either represent the sound that you make when you pronounce the words. In English, for example, the letter R has no meaning. It makes a sound, and when you put sounds together, you make words. But in Hebrew, every letter in the alphabet has profound spiritual meaning, and you derive the meaning of each letter from the name of the letter, from the shape of the letter, from the sound that the letter makes, from the numerical value of the letter, from something called the code of first letters. So the first time a letter appears at the beginning of a word in the Bible, is also indicative of the meaning of the letter. There are a whole slew of factors that go into the meaning of each Hebrew letter, and every letter in Hebrew, not just every word, every letter is radiating and pulsating with incredible spiritual meaning. And the claim that's made in Hebrew is something that's unique. We say in Hebrew that if you understand the meaning of the letters, if you really understand what the meaning of an Aleph is, and what the meaning of Bet is, and what the meaning of Gimel is, and if you understand reality, if you really understand reality, you will be able to write the lexicon. You'll be able to know what to call everything, what word belongs with everything in the world. And we see Adam doing this in the beginning of Genesis, where he names the animals. It wasn't arbitrary. When Adam named the animals, the Torah says that's what the animal was. The name that Adam chose, because of his incredible level of spirituality, he was able to know what each animal was and what the name had to be. It's not arbitrary. So Hebrew is an incredible language for all the reasons I mentioned. And so the question we have to ask when we get to the Greek scriptures is, why would God now change his mind and begin communicating, if this is his message, why begin communicating it in Greek? And it's a big problem. It's really a tremendous problem. Greek, in terms of all the things that we compared to Hebrew, doesn't really stand up. The fact that it may have been the lingua franca for many people at that time does not really mean much. I mean, it doesn't change the reality. It doesn't mean that Greek was the language that should have been used in the Hebrew scriptures. So that's one thing I just wanted to call to everyone's attention, that we're reading the book of Revelation and it was not composed in Hebrew. Although it's interesting, if you look at David Stern's commentary to the beginning of chapter 10 here, he almost hints at the fact that it may have been originally written in Hebrew, but there's really no evidence for this at all. Now, the second thing I wanted to point out is that in the Hebrew scriptures, God is always speaking. So in the Torah itself, in the 5 books of Moses, practically the most common verse is V'yadaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, that the Lord spoke to Moses saying. That's literally, God is on every page of the Bible speaking. And when you get to the prophets, the prophets didn't make up their prophecy. It says, thus says the Lord. This is what the Lord said. God is speaking throughout the Hebrew Bible. God is constantly speaking to mankind. It's significant that in the Greek scriptures, God does not speak. God does not speak in the Christian scriptures, in the Greek Testament. So again, it's important to bear this in mind, that we're going to see that there are all these parallels between the book of Revelation and books like Ezekiel and Daniel, etc. Well, these are books where God spoke, and in Revelation, God never speaks. And that's a significant thing to bear in mind. So when we go through this chapter, again, it's the kind of chapter that I think anyone that's going to be honest reading it is going to scratch their head and say, this is quite bizarre and quite strange. And basically, it's so easy to read into this kind of writing. It's like a Rorschach test for the reader. Really, any interpretation the reader gives is going to reveal more about the reader than it's going to reveal about the text itself. So I'm going to now compare verses 5 to 6 here in chapter 10 to a passage from the TaNaCh, to a passage from the Hebrew scriptures. In Revelation chapter 10, verses 5 to 6. So John says the following: The angel who I saw standing on the sea and on the land. So he describes earlier in the chapter that this angel was basically standing, straddling both the sea and the land. He raised his hand up to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever. The angel swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, the earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be delay no longer. Again, as we mentioned, Revelation is pretty much describing, according to many views, what is going to happen in the end times. Again, it's not the only view of Revelation, but according to, let's say, a very popular understanding of Revelation, it's describing what's going to unfold in the end times. And as John has been basically tracing these developments for us in terms of great persecution and destruction, now he's being told that it's not going to be drawn out. It's not going to be delayed. It's going to be basically something that unfolds quickly. That's the content of this passage that we just read, verses 5 through 6. I'm going to just read it one more time. The angel who I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised up his hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, the earth and the things that are in it, the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be delay no longer. Now, in the TaNaCh, we have an interesting passage which sounds very similar in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 7. And Daniel says here in verse 7, and I heard the man clothed in linen. Now, if we've been reading the book of Daniel all along, we know that the man clothed in linen is not some, human being that's, got a particular outfit on. If you go back to chapter 10 in Daniel, verse 5, so we know that this is an angel that had been speaking to Daniel. So in chapter 12 in Daniel, verse 7, when he says, I heard the man clothed in linen, this is the angel that's been speaking to him all along. So he says, I heard that the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river. Again, it's very similar to what John writes in Revelation. John's angel was standing on the sea and on the land. And here, this is an angel that Daniel hears who is above the waters of the river. And he lifted his right hand and left hand heavenward. Again, Revelation, John speaks about this angel swearing. Now, when a person lifts his hand up toward heaven, right, what are they going to do? So Daniel says, and he swore by the life of the world. And in Revelation, the angel swears by him who lives forever. That's basically the same expression as by the life of the world. And Daniel goes on to say that in a time, times and a half, and upon completion of the fragmenting of the hand of the holy people, all these shall be finished. Again, it's interesting that Daniel is also writing about what's going to be happening in the end times. Now, I'll just mention, I might be dating myself here. I am actually dating myself, that many, many years ago in a previous life, I saw a film that I really, really liked. And the film was called The Big Chill. And I think it came out in 1983. And I must have seen this film several times. I really, really enjoyed it. And then I had the opportunity to see another movie, not really as well known, a few years later, called The Return of the Secaucus 7. And that movie, I believe, it came out in 1979, about 4 years before The Big Chill. And after I saw this film, The Return of the Secaucus 7, I was really, really upset, very, very upset and disappointed, because it was very clear to me that the Big Chill ripped off the return of the Secaucus 7. Basically, the storyline, I mean, it was very obvious that, at least to me, that if you hadn't had the return of the Secaucus 7, you would never have had the Big Chill. It was very clear that the writers of the Big Chill were inspired by, they were moved by, they were essentially, they got their ideas from this earlier film that never really became as popular. And that's what happens, when I go through now the book of Revelation, and I keep on seeing passages that are essentially the same from much, much earlier, right? We're talking about passages in Daniel, like we just saw, passages in Ezekiel, which are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years prior to John's writing of his visions in the book of Revelation. And, we don't know what to make of this. Are we talking about, copyright infringement, or we're talking about, I remember growing up when there was a musical group that would sue another group for stealing their music, because they didn't steal the whole song, but the musical line, the riffs or whatever, were basically quote unquote borrowed. And so there's a lot, that's to be generous, there's a lot of borrowing going on in the book of Revelation. And again, it makes one wonder, why is it necessary? If John is really receiving some genuine message, it's sort of suspicious that so much of it already seems to have been lifted from prior revelation. Now, in chapter 10 here, verse 7, it says, "But in the days of the sounding of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God would be finished, as he declared to his servants, the prophets." The mystery of God would be finished, as he declared to his servants, the prophets. So what is this mystery that is going to be finished? And this mystery that was revealed to the prophets? It's not clear. And we have similar passages in the Christian Bible that speak about some divine mystery. I believe in Romans there's such a reference. It's interesting that David Stern, we've seen his commentary many times. He says, and I think many Christian commentaries agree with this here, that the mystery that's being spoken of here, which is basically the hidden plan of God, the hidden plan of God, which is, according to David Stern, the gospel. The gospel. And he says that even though this message was proclaimed to the prophets, it was proclaimed to the prophets. That's the claim, again, of John here in Revelation, and as it's understood by so many Christians. But they say that the prophets didn't really understand it. And that would explain basically why the Jewish people living at the time of Jesus didn't understand, the claims that were being made by the church. Again, the claims that, yes, Jesus is the Messiah, and the Messiah was supposed to die, and it was all part of God's plan, and it was necessary to have the Messiah die in order to atone for the sins of humanity, and through the death of the Messiah, who will be resurrected, human beings will all be able to live forever. I mean, the entire story of the gospel is something that for Jewish people sounded very foreign, because it really contradicts everything that we've known from the prophets, from what we've known about the utopian messianic age. And so the church always had a big problem. If the idea of the gospel is something that wasn't simply invented in the first century, if indeed it was something that was revealed to the prophets. So why was it such a mystery to the Jewish people in the first century? Didn't the prophets explain what they had received? Didn't the prophets explain their prophecy? Didn't the Jewish people have a tradition going back to the prophets that would have already known about the whole gospel message that the Messiah was supposed to come and die? But you see that the Jewish people didn't have such an understanding. You see it on the pages of the Christian Bible. So back in Matthew chapter 16, when you have Jesus finally asking his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Messiah. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Well, 25 points, you got that right. You realize, of course, that as the Messiah, I have to go to Jerusalem and be tortured and killed." And Peter doesn't say, "Well, of course, that was what the prophets told us," right? Peter doesn't say, "Well, duh, you must be the suffering servant of Isaiah chapter 53. No, Peter, to him, it sounds absurd. He says, "God forbid, this should never happen to you." So the idea that the prophets were already told about the gospel narrative is just not just refuted by the reaction of the normative, the sort of the traditional Jewish community in the first century. You see that every time in the Greek scriptures where Jesus allegedly, I don't believe he spoke about his impending death. I don't think Jesus was expecting, to die as a sacrifice. To me, these are words that were put into his mouth by the gospel writers. But in any event, every time in the gospel literature Jesus speaks about his impending death, it always says that his followers did not understand what he was talking about. They didn't understand what he was talking about. And the question is, why not? Why didn't they? If the prophets were already told this, and the prophets were the teachers of Israel, and they would have passed this down, this should have been a no-brainer. This should have been common knowledge in the first century. So you have people like David Stern here making the claim that the prophets didn't understand the revelation they received. They didn't get it. And that would explain why the Jews in the first century didn't get it, didn't understand. But this is the idea of this mystery that would be finished. Now, what's interesting is that in the Hebrew Bible, it's very clear that God does not want the date of the final redemption revealed. It's very clear that God is not interested in having this broadcast and publicized. I'll just give you two examples. In the book of Genesis, towards the very end of Genesis, it says that Jacob wanted to reveal the end to his children. He gathered them together. He said, "Come together, and I want to tell you what's going to happen in the end of days." And he never does that. He never reveals anything. And according to the Midrash, the rabbinic commentaries, God basically took this information away from him. God was not interested in Jacob revealing to his sons what is going to happen and when it's going to happen. That was not really something that is good for people to know. And then we see in the 12th chapter of the book of Daniel, God instructs Daniel to conceal the timing of the end, to seal it up in the book and not reveal when exactly the redemption is going to happen. However, that's the only thing that's not revealed. The vision of the final redemption, the contours of the final redemption, what the messianic age is going to look like, are fully revealed in Scripture. And it's revealed in almost all of the prophets. All of the prophets paint a pretty clear picture of what the end times are going to look like, what is going to take place. We don't know exactly to the last detail what the sequence is going to be. But what is going to happen, the scriptures paint fairly clearly. The only thing is that we're not told when it's going to happen. Isaiah says something peculiar. Isaiah says, I think it's in chapter 66, Be'ita achishena, in its time I will hasten it. And the Talmud takes this as contradictory. In its time I will hasten it? Well, that doesn't make sense. If it's in its time, it's in its time. It's not happening sooner than its time. So the sages of the Talmud say that there are two ways in which the redemption can unfold. It can happen in its time, meaning there is a set time for the redemption. It was never revealed to us, but there is a set time. And then there is achishena, I will hasten it, meaning it's possible for the redemption to happen sooner than its set time. And that would be if Israel is especially worthy, meaning if Israel is not especially worthy, the redemption will happen at its set time. If Israel is especially worthy, then God can hasten the time of the redemption. But aside from that sort of mysterious verse in Isaiah, the Bible does not really engage in discussions about when the redemption is going to happen. But the picture of what the redemption will look like is painted by virtually all the prophets in the Bible. And in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 19, the prophet says, I have not spoken in secret in some dark land. I did not say to the offspring of Jacob, seek me in emptiness. No, I, the Lord, speak righteousness and talk straightness. Isaiah is basically saying that God does not have these secrets and does not keep things mysterious. God speaks straight, and he hasn't spoken to us in secret. Doesn't keep things concealed from us, again, other than the actual date of the redemption, but the big picture, the general picture, the contours, we already know about from the prophets, including Isaiah. So now when we go a little bit further in the chapter to verses 8 through 11, we'll find something interesting. I'll just read verses 8 through 11 here in Revelation chapter 10. Then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again and said, go take the little book. Now, again, many people say that it's not a book that's really being spoken of. It's a little scroll. That's not going to really be material, whether it's a book or a scroll. I think it's more likely that back then we had scrolls and not books. In any event, the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again and said, go take the little scroll, which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth. This is the angel that we saw earlier, who's basically straddling heaven and the earth and the seas. And so I went, John says, I went to the angel and said to him, give me the little scroll. And he said to me, take and eat it. Take it and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth. And in verse 10, John says, then I took the little scroll out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, it became bitter in my stomach. And he said to me, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. That is Revelation chapter 10, verses 8 to 11. And this is something, again, if you've seen The Return of the Secaucus 7, you've seen this movie before. If you have studied the book of Yechezkel, the prophet Ezekiel, in chapter 3, says the following, and here it's God. Again, we mentioned earlier, it's God that speaks in the Jewish Bible. He, God, then said to me, Son of man. This is what God refers to Ezekiel as, like you're human being, son of man. That which you find, eat. That's what God says to him. What you find, eat. Eat this scroll. So this is exactly what Ezekiel is told. Eat this scroll. And go speak to the house of Israel. Now, this idea of the scroll, I just want to point out, comes up earlier in the book of Ezekiel. If you go back to chapter 2, in Ezekiel verse 9, he says, I saw, and behold, a hand was outstretched to me, and behold, in it was a scroll of parchment. So this is the scroll that God now is speaking about in chapter 3. And so Ezekiel says, so I opened my mouth, and he fed me that scroll. And he said to me, Son of man, feed your stomach and fill your inwards with this scroll that I give to you. So I ate, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. This all sounds very, very familiar because we see it in Revelation, almost word for word. And then later in chapter 3, verse 14, it says, this again in Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 14, thus a wind lifted me and took me, and I went in bitterness, in the wrath of my spirit, and the hand of the Lord was strong upon me. So you see both the elements of sweetness in the mouth and bitterness in this chapter as well. And what is meant when it speaks about eating this scroll? Why does God have the prophet eat the scroll? So basically, the way it's understood, and it's sort of obvious, is that it's a way of making the message of the scroll part of yourself. It means absorbing. It means that God wants him to absorb the message of the scroll and to absorb God's message itself. So that's basically, we have a very short chapter in here in chapter 10 of Revelation. It only is 11 verses long. But that's really what I had to share this morning. And I look forward to, God willing, continuing with you soon in chapter 11.
That sounds...
Chapter 11 doesn't sound good. That sounds like we're going to go bankrupt. But we'll be doing chapter 11 soon, God willing.
Well, that's one good way to end the New Testament, is in chapter 11. Even though there's a few more to go, so that's all right, though. Well, good deal. All right, thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back here shortly. So Rabbi Singer will be airing today, not yesterday. So if you missed it, you didn't miss it. So just tune in here just shortly. Rabbi, once again, we love your work. Thank you for all your time and dedication, and we'll look forward to seeing you same time, same place, Hashem willing, next week. So you all have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you all. Bye-bye. Shalom, my dear friends. Hope this message finds you well. If you like the way this channel is going, and the channel has been a blessing to you, please consider supporting the channel by going to the website, TaNaChTalk.com, TaNaChTalk.com. Thank you once again for your time and for supporting TaNaCh Talk. Shalom.